Hey, welcome to another relief carving video. In this one I carved a very detailed farm country scene. I live in a very rural area and the land is dominated by farms, so I felt this design of carving was due. I loved carving my grandpa's cabin in the past, so I was really excited to give another building a try. This project was carved out of white pine wood and took me around 45 hours to complete. I started by separating the layers and roughly deciding how deep I wanted to carve each one. I carved the background as deep as I could, leaving only 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch thick from the back of the wood. I then carved the depth of the different levels of trees. I kept in mind that the trees in the distance of the carving don't need as much thickness as the ones closer to the viewer. Due to the several curves along the layer's edge, I used my Dremel to speed up the process a bit. It saved me time from having to constantly switch out different gouges to make the stop cuts. I roughed in the field by carving it back to its approximate depth, and I then tapered it towards the background. I wanted to make sure I had plenty of wood for the barn, so I carved the field as deep as I could, but I made sure there was still a gradual taper towards the background. This gives the field a natural look, but maximizes the depth, giving me plenty of wood to shape the barn later. This was kind of a crucial area in the carving because it's where several layers meet, so I had to slowly work through it a little bit at a time. If I made a mistake of the layers depths here, it could really throw the whole perspective of the carving off. After roughing in that area, I flattened the side of the wheat field and began carving in the fencing. Tapering the front of the barn was next, which was actually quite difficult. I had to make sure it was as flat as possible and consistent throughout that entire front. The closest post to the viewer was my tapering point. From there, I tapered back in both directions, giving the barn some shape. Once it was roughed in, I spent some time sanding and making sure it was flat. High or low spots would really distort the look of it. After it was roughed in, I transferred more of the design onto the barn and continued to shape it. My plan was to carve 2 stacks of firewood underneath the overhang here. At this point, I just blocked them out, giving them a general shape and taper. I made a couple adjustments here from the design, which made the carve a bit easier. I ran into problems when blocking out the 2 stacks near the post. The front stack of wood I pushed to the right slightly. This allowed the rear of that stack to disappear behind the post, so I wouldn't have to carve it on the left side of the post. That was just such a tight and small area, which would have been very difficult to carve right. The adjustment really saved me some headache and I think looked much nicer in the end. I then transferred the window and large garage door onto the wood and carved in the openings. It was important to make sure the sides were straight up and down and parallel to the design. If just slightly off, it could really mess up the look of the barn when I carve in the siding later. A good lighting trick here is to taper deeper in the openings towards the main portion of the building. This adds some unique depth and gives the lighting a more realistic appearance. After carving in the openings and trim, I transferred the siding onto the wood from the design. This was actually very difficult to get right, and I spent quite a bit of time on it, making sure it was even and parallel before I started. I had to make some adjustments to the openings as well, in order for the barn as a whole to look right. Once I got it down though, I was able to start probably my favorite part of the carving. I worked construction with my dad years ago, and I installed siding on multiple homes with him and my brothers. Carving in this siding kind of brought me back to those great days, working on the job site with them. I wasn't really sure how I wanted to carve in the shingles on the roof. I ended up using my small V-gouge and carved in as shallow as possible, and I used a file to sand away the lower line, giving it an overlapping appearance. Again, I didn't want it to be super pronounced, so I sanded the area to tone down the shadows a bit. I used a template throughout as well to maintain the right angle of each shingle, which really helped to keep everything consistent. The wood stack under the overhang was a fun challenge. I struggled initially, but when I figured out a technique on how to carve it, it was fun watching it take shape. The important thing here was to make sure the wood pieces on the outer edges were well carved. Once I was happy with the outer pieces, I used a combination of gouges and Dremel to carve in the rest of the stack. I mixed up the lengths of each piece, giving it some shadows and depth, and I maintained that inward angle with each piece to keep the stack looking consistent. Next, I shaped the treetops behind the barn. I carved in deep gaps throughout the trees that exposes the tree branches. With gouges, I then blocked in the treetops, giving it some depth and creating shadows. With these trees directly behind the barn, I was fairly aggressive and made deep cuts. Then with my Dremel, I carved in the leaf texture with my circular bit technique. With 2 different sized rounded bits, I made random strokes varying in pressure throughout the treetops, first starting with the large rounded bit and then followed by the smaller one. Carving in the field was definitely a challenge. I ended up using a scrap piece of wood and tried different textures and techniques. I eventually figured out a technique that I really liked, using a combination of gouges and Dremel. I carved in wavy horizontal strokes with a gouge that gradually gets smaller as I go further in the distance. Then I follow it up with my Dremel carving in the details. The section of trees on the left side here was carved in the middle of 2 extremes, a happy medium between aggressively deep and shallow carving. When carving in the distant trees, I made sure to make much shallower strokes compared to the closer section of trees. The shadows needed to be quite a bit smaller and less pronounced. This really helps give the illusion that the trees are further in the distance and helps establish the depth throughout the carving. The last step to complete the carving was to carve in a grass and gravel texture. This gravel texture actually took me quite a bit of time and was tedious stuff making those tiny strokes. Let's just say I was pretty happy when that texture was all said and done. After 45 hours, this carving is finished. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and as always, make sure you share, like, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.